Russia didn't stand on the sidelines of the Gaza-Israel war. It played directly into it. While the world was watching rockets, airstrikes, and ceasefire talks, Moscow was moving pieces in the background to weaken the United States and divide its allies. One of the boldest signals came when Russia openly hosted Hamas leaders in Moscow. This wasn't a secret diplomatic channel. It was intentional theater. By giving Hamas political recognition on Russian soil, the Kremlin sent a calculated message. America may call them terrorists, but Russia treats them like players in the new world order. Russian foreign ministry officials pushed the narrative further. They claimed that the Gaza conflict proved the United States was failing as a global power. They didn't hide their satisfaction. They said, almost mockingly, that Washington could no longer control events in the Middle East, a region it once dominated through force, aid, and alliances. It wasn't just rhetoric. Russia used every media outlet and diplomatic platform available to frame Gaza as America's weakness, not Israel's fight. Russian state television spoke of American-backed brutality, while ignoring Iran's funding of Hamas. In the United Nations, Moscow positioned itself as a defender of Palestinians and a critic of Western hypocrisy. This wasn't about morality. It was geopolitics with perfect timing. And that timing mattered, because while Gaza burned, Ukraine bled. Every missile launched by Israel, every U.S. air defense system diverted to the Middle East, every emergency funding bill debated in Congress, all of it meant one thing for Putin: less focus on the war in Ukraine. Russia understood something most people missed. The United States cannot fight two proxy wars at full strength at the same time. So, by amplifying the Gaza crisis, Moscow forced Washington to split its political capital, its attention, its stockpiles, and its military aid. The effect was immediate. Ammunition that was supposed to go to Ukraine was redirected to Israel. Artillery shells, missile interceptors, and armored packages were delayed by months. Even Pentagon officials quietly admitted that the U.S. could not sustain high-intensity support for both wars without consequences. To Russia, the Gaza war wasn't a distraction. It was a tool. Every dollar spent on Israel meant a dollar Ukraine wouldn't see on time. Every news cycle covering Gaza meant fewer headlines about the Donbass, Crimea, and Russian advances. And while Western leaders condemned Russia publicly, their legislatures got stuck arguing over which ally to fund first. Ukraine didn't stay neutral in the Gaza-Israel war. It chose a side, and that decision pulled it directly into the conflict. While most of the world viewed Gaza and Ukraine as separate wars, Kyiv understood the link immediately. Iran. The same Iran funding and arming Hamas was also supplying Russia with drones, ammunition, and military technology for use on Ukrainian soil. Zelensky didn't wait for diplomatic language. He said it clearly. Hamas and Russia are the same evil, supported by the same backers. By backing Israel, Ukraine wasn't making a moral statement. It was making a military calculation. Israel had what Ukraine needed: combat-proven drones, cyber defense systems, electronic warfare technology, missile interception intelligence, experience tracking Iranian weapons. And Israel had something else: data. Every time Russia launched Iranian-made drones like the Shahed 136, Israel's intelligence network knew their origin, flight patterns, manufacturers, and upgrades. Quietly, Israel shared critical intelligence with Ukraine, helping them shoot down Iranian drones repainted with Russian markings. In return, Ukraine gave Israel political cover and public backing. At the United Nations, it refused to condemn Israel and instead framed Hamas as part of the same strategic threat that fuels Moscow's war machine. For Kyiv, this wasn't ideology, it was battlefield math. Behind the scenes, Ukrainian officials pushed for access to Israeli drone tech targeting software and anti-jamming systems. Some of it came officially through allies. Some of it came indirectly through defense partnerships and silent transfers. What mattered is that Ukraine saw Gaza not as someone else's war, but as another front in the same global conflict, one where Iran and Russia sit on one side, and Israel and Ukraine sit on the other. So while the world debated narratives, Ukraine positioned itself inside the conflict, not symbolically, strategically. By backing Israel, Ukraine strengthened its own war effort against Russia, onboarded Israeli intelligence, and tightened the pressure on Tehran, the shared supplier of both Hamas and Moscow. This wasn't neutrality, it was alignment. And it proved that the Gaza war and the Ukraine war were not separate fires. They were being fed from the same flame. Iran is not a background player. It is the bridge that connects the Gaza war and the war in Ukraine directly. The link isn't symbolic, it's material. The same people, the same funding channels, the same weapons routes, and in many cases, the same factories are feeding both conflicts at the same time. When Hamas fires rockets from Gaza, most of those designs originate from Iranian engineers. When Israel intercepts drones or missiles coming from Palestinian factions, the blueprints trace back to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. When militants in Gaza build locally, they build using Iranian training, smuggled parts, and regional networks funded by Tehran. Now shift to Ukraine. Those same Iranian engineers are the ones building the Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 suicide drones, the same drones Russia is launching at Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, and Ukrainian energy infrastructure. The same type of explosives used in Gaza workshops are built in Iranian factories that mass-produce munitions for Russia's air campaigns. This is not coincidence. It is coordination. Iran has openly declared that its support for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and the Houthis is part of a larger axis of resistance strategy, a strategy that now includes Russia as a military client. It is the first time in modern history that Iran is supplying a world power in an active war, and that world power, Russia, is rewarding Iran with money, diplomatic protection, and advanced military technology in return. Every drone that hits a Ukrainian power plant strengthens Iran's defense industry. Every artillery shell Hamas fires from Gaza reinforces Tehran's justification for producing more weapons. When Russia makes a payment for Iranian drones, fuel, or ballistic systems, that money does not stay in Moscow. It returns to Tehran, and Tehran uses it to finance Hamas, the IRGC, Hezbollah, and its regional proxies. The smuggling networks are the same. The Iranian ships moving drone parts to Russia use the same routes used to transport weapons into Gaza through Sudan, Sinai, Syria, and Lebanon. The same IRGC commanders overseeing drone shipments to Moscow have decades of experience moving arms to Hamas and Hezbollah. Even training overlaps. Iranian technicians who trained Hamas rocket builders are the same types of specialists now advising Russian forces on drone operations, flight patterns, and battlefield adaptation. Some of those Iranians have rotated between fronts. First Syria, then Lebanon, then Crimea, then Gaza. They're not guessing. They're experienced. This is why the Gaza war is not isolated. Every escalation in Gaza makes Iran look stronger regionally. A stronger Iran has more leverage over Russia, and Russia, in turn, uses that relationship to pressure Ukraine and challenge the West. When the U.S. sends weapons to Israel, Iran responds by boosting support to Hamas and Hezbollah. When the U.S. sends weapons to Ukraine, Iran steps up drone deliveries to Moscow. So at every stage, Iran is the middleman of conflict, one hand in Gaza, the other in Ukraine. When Gaza goes to war, Iran rises. When Iran rises, Russia benefits. And when Russia benefits, Ukraine loses ground, loses time, and loses resources. The conflicts are not separate. They are connected by design, supply chain, and strategy. To say the Gaza war strengthens Russia is not speculation. It is a direct consequence of Iran acting as the weapons bridge between both battlefields. You can track the flow from IRGC workshops to Hamas tunnels, from Iranian drone hangars to Russian military depots. This is one network, not two wars. Weapons didn't just shift between conflicts, they were redirected in real time. The United States had stockpiles set aside for Ukraine, meant to sustain its defenses against Russia. But once the Gaza war reignited, those same supplies were pulled, reassigned, and flown to Israel instead. This wasn't rumor. It was confirmed by Pentagon logistics and quietly acknowledged by officials who understood the trade-off. The most striking example was artillery. Ukraine's military was burning through 155mm shells at a rate of thousands per day. European production couldn't keep up, and the U.S. had stepped in to fill the gaps. But when the Gaza conflict erupted, the Pentagon sent at least 300,000 of those shells from U.S. stockpiles in Europe, not to Kyiv, but to Israel. Every one of those shells taken from Ukraine's future inventory became part of Israel's immediate war plan. Missile defense systems saw the same shift. Ukraine had been asking for more Patriot and Iris-T interceptors to protect its cities from Russian air and drone attacks. Instead, Washington accelerated the delivery of Iron Dome supplies and air defense interceptors to Israel. Congressional packages that were supposed to be fast-tracked for Ukraine were suddenly entangled in debates over how to divide funds between two active war zones. And behind closed doors, Pentagon planners admitted the truth. The U.S. cannot fully arm two major conflicts at once without sacrificing speed. So Ukraine waited. Funding bills stalled, shells didn't arrive on schedule, and defensive systems meant for the Eastern Front were pushed into the Middle East. Russia saw the opening and moved immediately. Within weeks of the diversion, Russian forces ramped up their offensives across Donbass and Kupiansk. Intelligence reports noted that Russia began launching wave attacks with fewer consequences, timing assaults precisely during ammunition shortages on the Ukrainian side. Every delay in delivery meant fewer artillery responses, less air defense coverage, and stretched Ukrainian lines. Even basic resupply missions slowed. Pentagon officials confirmed that certain GMLRS rockets, HIMARS rounds, and precision munitions were delayed due to shifting priorities. Publicly, nothing was admitted. But on the battlefield, the impact was undeniable. Russia intensified drone strikes, artillery pushes, and armored maneuvers, not because it had new strength, but because Ukraine had new shortages. This wasn't theory, it was logistics. Every war depends on ammo, missiles, and timing. And when Gaza consumed American attention and stockpiles, Ukraine paid the price, mile by mile, shell by shell. That is not indirect. That is not symbolic. That is a direct impact on the battlefield, shaped by a decision to supply one war at the expense of another. Russia didn't have to sabotage Ukraine's weapons flow. Gaza did it for them. Russia didn't just observe the Gaza war, it benefited from it strategically. The more America focused on Gaza, the less it could give Ukraine. Moscow understood that Washington cannot politically, militarily, or financially sustain two major conflicts at full throttle. So while the world treated Gaza and Ukraine as separate crises, the Kremlin saw one opportunity with two fronts. When Hamas launched its attack and Israel responded, the U.S. government immediately shifted high-level focus. Intelligence briefings, weapons contracts, diplomatic missions, and emergency aid packages were redirected. And Russia used that shift to apply pressure. Inside NATO, the Gaza war split attention and strained unity. European states already struggling to sustain financial support for Ukraine suddenly faced new demands. Humanitarian aid, Middle East stabilization, fuel costs, and security reassessments. Governments in Hungary, Slovakia, and even parts of Germany used the Gaza conflict as political cover to stall or criticize further Ukraine funding. The alliance that once spoke with one voice began to sound divided. In Washington, the split was even clearer. The same Congress that had been deadlocked on Ukraine funding for months suddenly rushed aid to Israel with bipartisan backing. Debate shifted from how to stop Russia to how to guarantee Israeli air support, hostage negotiations, and regional containment. Ukraine fell off the front page and off the funding priority list. Some lawmakers openly argued that support for Ukraine should be paused until the situation in Gaza was addressed. Others insisted that resources could not be shared evenly. Every hour Congress spent debating Israel was an hour Ukraine lost in artillery, interceptors, and logistics. Russia didn't have to push propaganda alone. American lawmakers and European divisions did the work. Kremlin officials then amplified those fractures globally, presenting the West as overstretched and indecisive. Russian state media claimed that the United States was abandoning Ukraine and pointed to aid delays as proof. On the battlefield, that messaging became morale warfare. This wasn't an indirect effect, it was a coordinated advantage. Gaza became a pressure valve that released focus away from Kyiv and redirected fear, funding, and foreign policy into the Middle East. The Kremlin didn't need to escalate its own war to gain ground. The West-Est distraction did that automatically. By the time new funding debates began in the US and Europe, Russia had already launched fresh offensives, rotated troops, rebuilt missile stockpiles, and strengthened frontline positions. And while Ukraine waited for decisions, Russia acted on them. The Gaza war divided attention, divided funding, and divided alliances, and every division bought Moscow time, weapons, and freedom to maneuver, not by accident, but by design. Russia didn't just sit back and watch the Gaza-Israel war unfold. It benefited directly and used it as a weapon against the West. The moment the conflict reignited, Moscow understood one thing. Every missile fired in Gaza pulled Western attention away from Ukraine. Every emergency session on Israel delayed decisions on Ukraine. Every dollar, shell, and interceptor sent to the Middle East was one less available for the Eastern Front. The Kremlin knew the United States could not fully fund two separates. The Gaza war didn't just overlap with the conflict in Ukraine. It exposed how vulnerable Western strategy becomes when two high-demand crises erupt at the same time. And Russia understood from the beginning that it didn't need to win propaganda wars. It just needed to stretch the West thin enough that choices had to be made. Inside Washington, the consequences were immediate. Congressional funding meant for Ukraine was stalled, restructured, or bundled into controversial multi-conflict aid bills that sparked political deadlock. Lawmakers began arguing openly about whether Ukraine or Israel should take priority. The delay wasn't measured in weeks. It was measured in ammunition loads, artillery shortages, paused contracts, and postponed shipments. On the battlefield, that delay translated into danger. Ukraine began rationing shells in sectors where Russian assaults were intensifying. Some frontline commanders reported cutting their artillery use by half while awaiting resupply. Russian forces noticed. They pushed forward when Ukrainian units were forced to hold fire. But Russia's advantage wasn't only in resources. It was in perception. If the world turns its attention away from a war, the urgency surrounding that war collapses. That collapse weakens public support, slows decisions, and fractures alliances. And that is exactly what happened. International news networks that once covered every Ukrainian counteroffensive shifted their spotlight to airstrikes in Gaza. European newspapers replaced headlines about Crimea and Kharkiv with stories of Rafah and Khan Yunis. Social media shifted sympathy and outrage toward a different battleground. It became harder for Ukraine to command attention, and without attention, it's harder to command aid. Russia leaned into that shift with its own media machine. State television, Kremlin spokespeople, and diplomats claimed the West had abandoned Ukraine and could no longer afford its promises. They framed the U.S. as hypocritical, overstretched, and incapable of sustaining global influence. And in parts of Africa, Latin America, the Arab world, and even the Balkans, that narrative found footing. Even NATO, united on paper, began to show cracks. Some member states insisted the Middle East should take priority. Others argued that their stockpiles could not support both wars without domestic backlash. Energy prices, migrant fears, and domestic protests became political shields for inaction. Russia didn't have to divide NATO. The pressure did it for them. While all this was happening, Iran tightened its partnership with Russia, using Gaza as proof of its power projection. Every escalation in Gaza was used by Tehran to justify expanded weapons programs and militia funding. And every missile or drone Ukraine managed to shoot down over Kyiv eventually found its way back to the same manufacturers supplying Hamas and Hezbollah. Meanwhile, U.S. military analysts admitted quietly, American stockpiles are not endless. Patriot missiles, 155mm shells, HIMARS rounds, and tactical interceptors cannot be manufactured overnight. When two allies need them at once, one of them will wait. And delays in war are not neutral. They have consequences on the ground. Russia knew that. It waited for that moment, then exploited it. The Gaza war was not treated as a humanitarian tragedy in Moscow. It was treated as a strategic window. As soon as it opened, the Kremlin moved. And while Western audiences argued about ceasefires, occupation, and hostages, Russian forces expanded trenches, rotated troops, built missile stockpiles, and advanced in sectors where Ukrainian resistance had thinned. What looked like coincidence on the news was, in reality, synchrony on the battlefield. What made this overlap even more powerful for Russia was the psychological effect it created in Western capitals. The Gaza war didn't just divide funding and logistics, it triggered political hesitation, ideological fractures, and media fatigue. And indecision is a currency in war. Whoever waits less gains more. In Europe, parliaments that had once stood firmly behind Ukraine began to splinter under pressure from energy concerns, refugee debates, and rising populist movements. Leaders who once spoke of stopping Putin at all costs suddenly shifted their language toward limitations, reassessment, and competing priorities. Gaza became a shield for hesitation. It allowed politicians to delay aid without admitting retreat. In the U.S., the effect was even clearer. Every emergency bill for Ukraine had to compete with an emergency bill for Israel. Every package meant for defense allocation had to be negotiated twice. Lawmakers used the Middle East as justification to cut, postpone, or dilute Ukraine's support. And Russian intelligence was watching every committee hearing, every delay, every public statement. When resources and political capital are finite, pressure decides where they are spent. While American aircraft were landing in Tel Aviv with fresh stockpiles, Ukrainian artillery crews were recalculating daily fire limits. The Pentagon had to shuffle air defense interceptors, shells, and armored vehicles from one war zone to another. That shuffling created shortages that Russia exploited immediately on the ground. And then there was the media war. For nearly 2 years, Ukraine dominated global headlines. Every strike, every advance, every speech. But once Gaza reignited, the focus shifted instantly. Screens that once displayed Bakhmut and Kherson now showed Gaza City and Rafah. The suffering was real on both sides, but in geopolitics, attention is leverage. If the world stops watching you, your enemies stop worrying about consequences. Russia seized that silence. While Gaza filled every news broadcast, Moscow intensified missile barrages on Ukrainian power grids, stepped up electronic warfare, and tested new drone strategies without facing immediate international outcry. A war that loses the spotlight loses urgency, and Russia knew that well. Iran understood the moment too. The more Gaza burned, the more Tehran's influence expanded. While the West focused on ceasefires, hostage negotiations, and airstrikes, Iran strengthened ties with Russia through drone shipments, ballistic missile support, fuel deals, and intelligence exchanges. Every week of global distraction gave the alliance time to grow. China watched carefully. Beijing saw that the United States was spreading itself thin. It noted how long aid took to move, how difficult it was to maintain united political will, and how quickly attention fractures under pressure. That matters, because Taiwan is watching too. What ties it all together is this. Wars don't need to be connected on a map to be connected in effect. When the same suppliers arm both conflicts, when the same adversaries benefit from Western fatigue, when the same funding pipelines must feed two fronts at once, and when the same geopolitical rivals exploit every distraction, the wars are not separate. They reinforce each other. The Gaza war didn't just coincide with the conflict in Ukraine. It synchronized with it at the exact moment Russia needed space to breathe and time to advance. Hamas struck, Israel mobilized, Washington reacted, Congress got entangled, NATO hesitated, and Russia stepped forward. That's not coincidence. That's timing as a weapon.